When my husband and I moved into this house, we were thrilled. It was an old colonial-style home with plenty of space for our little family. The moment I stepped into what would become my daughter's bedroom, something felt off. It was subtle, just a faint pressure in the air, a heaviness that settled in my chest. But I brushed it aside. New homes, even old ones, take time to get used to. 3 months passed and life fell into a comfortable rhythm. Our 6-year-old daughter, Emily, seemed to love her new room. She would spend hours playing, sometimes giggling at nothing. I figured it was normal. Kids had vivid imaginations. But then she started talking to someone. At first, it was harmless. I'd walk by her room and hear her murmuring softly. When I asked who she was talking to, she simply said, "Mr. Tall." "Who's Mr. Tall?" I asked. "He's my friend," she said with a shy smile. I assumed it was an imaginary friend, which wasn't unusual for kids her age. But the way she talked about him unsettled me. "He's very tall," she said one evening while I was tucking her into bed. "He touches the ceiling." That sent a shiver down my spine. Something about it just felt wrong. "Does he live here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. Emily nodded. "Yes, he says this is his house." I laughed nervously. "Well, it's our house now." She frowned, looking at the corner of the room. "Mr. Tall says it's still his." A cold chill crawled up my arms, but I didn't want to scare her, so I kissed her forehead and told her to go to sleep. That night, I dreamed of shadows stretching across the walls, of something lurking just beyond my sight. When I woke up, my heart was pounding, though I couldn't remember why. It wasn't until a few nights later that things escalated. I was lying in bed when I heard whispering. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but then I realized it was coming from Emily's room. I sat up, listening carefully. A pause. Then, in a hushed voice, I heard Emily say, "Okay, I'll ask." I frowned and got out of bed, my feet silent against the hardwood floor as I walked to her room. I pushed the door open just a crack and peered inside. Emily was sitting up in bed, looking straight at me. Her face was calm, but her eyes were serious. "Mommy," she said softly, "Mr. Tall wants to know why you're sleeping in his room." I froze. His room. My throat was dry. Emily nodded, then glanced at the far corner of the room. Her expression changed, her brows furrowed as if she was listening to something I couldn't hear. After a few moments, she whispered, "Mr. Tall says it used to be his." A cold weight settled in my stomach. I followed her gaze but saw nothing, just an empty corner. But I felt something, a presence. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, wrong. I forced a smile and walked over to her bed. "Sweetie, no one else is here," I whispered, brushing her hair back. "It's just us." She hesitated, then whispered back, "He doesn't like when you say that." My body went rigid. A part of me wanted to laugh it off, to tell myself she was just a kid with an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew. We were not alone. The next morning, I told my husband about what happened. He chuckled at first, but when he saw how shaken I was, his smile faded. "Maybe she just overheard something," he said. "Overheard what? We don't even know the history of this place," I shot back. That was when I decided to do some digging. I spent the afternoon researching the house's history. It took some time, but eventually I found something. A name buried in old property records. The house had once belonged to a man named Victor Langley. He had lived here with his daughter for many years, until she passed away from a serious illness. Stricken with grief, he remained in the house alone, consumed by loneliness and the loss of her. Eventually, unable to bear the emptiness, he took his own life. His sudden disappearance went unnoticed for some time, and soon after, the house was abandoned. His nickname? Mr. Tall. My skin prickled. I scrolled further. There was a single grainy photo attached to an old newspaper clipping. It showed a man standing in front of the house. He was thin, gaunt, and disturbingly tall. I slammed my laptop shut. That night, I moved Emily into our room, and when I went back to her room to grab some of her things, I didn't dare look at the corner, because I knew, somewhere in the shadows, he was watching. We didn't go back into Emily's room that night. I told myself it was just a precaution, that I was being irrational, letting my imagination get the better of me. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was in that room, and it knew I had seen it. Emily, however, didn't seem to share my unease. She didn't complain or whimper in fear when I set up a small bed for her in our room, but she did look confused. "Why can't I sleep in my room, Mommy?" she asked, tilting her head. I hesitated, searching for the right words. "I just think it'd be fun to have a sleepover in here for a little while." She considered this, then shrugged. "Okay." That was it. No fear, no concern. She just curled up under the blanket, content. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us leave that room. Watching. And waiting. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the old house made my pulse jump. My husband, Mark, slept soundly beside me, unaware of the growing dread pressing down on me like a weight. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to a sound, a faint rhythmic scratching. I blinked, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was silent except for Mark's steady breathing and the hum of the heater kicking on. But then, there it was again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The noise was coming from down the hall, from Emily's room. I swallowed hard. My first instinct was to wake Mark, but something told me not to. Some primal part of me whispered that if I acknowledged it, if I spoke of it aloud, it would get worse. I hesitated, then slowly slid out of bed. The floor was cold beneath my feet as I crept toward the hallway. The door to Emily's room was open just a crack. I reached out with trembling fingers and pushed it wider. The room was empty. The soft glow of the nightlight cast shadows along the walls, stretching them unnaturally. I stepped inside, my breath shallow. Then I saw it. Emily's heart-shaped plush sat in the middle of the room. It shouldn't have been there. When I tucked her in earlier that night, she'd been curled up with it, holding it close like she always did. She never slept without it. But now it was sitting upright, perfectly placed, as if someone had set it there on purpose. My stomach twisted. I took a slow, careful step forward. The air felt off, thick and heavy, as if I had just stepped into a space that someone else had only recently left. The plush looked so small, so deliberate, sitting in the empty room. I bent down and picked it up. The fabric was unnaturally cold, as though it had been sitting alone in the dark for hours. A sharp prickle of unease ran down my spine. I wasn't alone. I slowly turned and walked out of the room, my heart racing. I headed straight for our bedroom, where Mark and Emily were both asleep. I closed the door quietly behind me, trying to shake the unsettling feeling that followed me. The next morning, Emily was as cheerful as ever, completely unfazed by the fact that she had spent the night in our room. If anything, she seemed more confused by my reaction than by the change in routine. "When can I sleep in my room again?" she asked over breakfast, swinging her legs under the chair. I hesitated. "We'll see, sweetheart. Maybe in a few nights." She frowned. "Why?" I glanced at Mark, who was reading something on his phone, completely detached from the conversation. I knew he thought I was overreacting. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply, horribly wrong. Out of nowhere, Emily spoke up, looking at me with wide, innocent eyes. "Mommy, Mr. Tall said you're worried, but you don't need to be." "You talked to him last night?" She nodded, taking another bite of cereal. "Yeah, he was just wondering why I wasn't in my room." I swallowed. "And what did you say?" Emily shrugged. "I told him I didn't know, that maybe you just like having me close." She smiled like it was the most ordinary conversation in the world. I forced a chuckle. "I do like having you close." She grinned, swinging her feet under the table. "Mr. Tall said he understands. He remembers what it was like to take care of someone." A cold shiver ran through me, but I kept my expression neutral. "Did he say anything else?" I asked, my voice quiet, trying to keep the unease from seeping through. Emily paused, her little brow furrowing as she thought. She took another bite of her cereal, then looked up at me, her expression innocent. "He said he understands why you're worried. He says you're just trying to protect me." I swallowed, my mind racing. "And what else?" She shrugged, her small shoulders lifting as she settled back into her chair. "He said he's been alone for a long time, that he used to take care of his daughter, but she's not here anymore." A shiver ran down my spine. Emily's eyes darkened for just a moment, but then she smiled as if the memory didn't faze her. "He doesn't like talking about it, but he said that's why he stays, to make sure I'm safe, so no one's alone." The words wrapped around me like a cold fog, but I held on to them, trying to make sense of them. "He wants to take care of you?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. She nodded, her little voice soft and serious. "Yeah, he says that's why he likes to watch over me. He says he feels better when I'm not scared." I exhaled slowly, my thoughts swirling. It was strange, but there was something almost comforting in what Emily was saying. It didn't sound threatening. It sounded like Mr. Tall genuinely cared, like he wanted to protect her the way he had once protected his own daughter. I reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from Emily's face, trying to smile. "And what else did Mr. Tall say?" Emily's eyes sparkled as she recalled the conversation. "He said I shouldn't worry about anything. He'll make sure nothing bad happens." A small part of me wanted to believe it, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Even though Mr. Tall seemed kind, even though his intentions seemed good, I couldn't ignore the heaviness that had settled in the air ever since Emily first mentioned him. I forced another smile. "That's very nice of him." She nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, Mr. Tall is nice. He just wants to make sure no one is alone. He says that's what he does." I felt a strange mix of relief and unease, unsure whether I should feel comforted or wary. But one thing was certain. Mr. Tall wasn't here to harm us. He was here to care for us in the way he knew best, and that realization was both a blessing and a curse.